Let me go ahead and get started.
Rudy's on the phone.
Hi, Rudy. It's Matt. Rudy?
Yeah,
Good morning.
good morning.
Okay, do we have anyone else on the phone? I think Mary Spildy is going to be joining us. And I'm going to start by saying good morning and thanks to everybody for coming in and participating today. I want to start by just talking a little bit about process and a little bit about where we are by way of workflow. We are, in terms of a committee, we're 2 down, 3 to go in terms of meetings. 2 meetings thus far, 3 more to go, including the one today. The first 2 meetings were mostly receiving testimony, hearing from stakeholders. I want to thank all the stakeholders that did contribute on those meetings and also subsequently in terms of written comments. But now I think the real work starts for this committee. So from this point forward, most of what we're going to be doing is going to be vetting a straw proposal that we're going to see here in a moment. So for the next 3 meetings, that's going to be really the bulk of our work. So we appreciate all the input that we've received. Now we're going to do our best to take that input and develop a solid recommendation. We will continue to receive input along the way. We will have public testimony included today, so we'll invite that. If anyone wants to provide feedback on what they hear in this discussion today, we certainly would appreciate that. But again, we're going to force ourselves as a committee to do the real hard work that we've been hired and paid so well to do. So with that, I want to put Ben on the spot one more time to just very succinctly recap after these next 3 meetings, as we look to December 11th and the next OEIB meeting, just if you could once again summarize what's a home run for this committee? What are we expected to deliver?
So the expectation and the request is that this committee bring to the December 11th meeting of the full OEIB a recommendation for the general organization of the state's boards and commissions system for education. So we certainly don't expect that this committee will have fleshed out every detail that will be required in law to move a concept forward. There will be a significant amount of work to do to use a general recommendation from this committee, hopefully also then adopted by the full OEIB to guide the development of legislation that would be introduced by the governor in 2013. But we are looking to you and then the full OEIB for a recommendation on the sort of general organization of the state's boards and commission system for education.
Okay. Is that a Word document? I mean, what exactly should this recommendation, what form should it take?
I think I'd leave that largely in your hands, and Rudy and I will continue to participate in these meetings and work with you on that and support the development of a product that reflects as far as this group is able to get.
Okay.
But our hope would be that those materials then are discussed, additional public input is taken, and the full OEIB feels comfortable advancing them forward into the next phase of developing legislation.
So,
Go ahead.
in theory then, we have the December meeting of OEIB, and assuming there is support for the committee's work, those will be translated into legislative concepts to then be advanced into the legislative process. That's
correct. One of the governor has essentially 2 education-related priorities for 2013. One, of course, is the budget, which he's very much working on now, guided by the OEIB's recommendation around priorities. The other is this work on the organization and design of the state infrastructure, including the state board and commission system. We have a placeholder bill essentially now for the 2013 legislative session. Our expectation is that the governor will, early in the session, will bring a comprehensive amendment to that placeholder bill that reflects the general work that this committee and the full OEIB does, and then the additional kind of detailed work that the governor, his staff does with legislators and others to kind of work through those details.
Yeah, so just with a little bit of a sense of where we're going today, I understand how a discussion about boards and governance works for higher education. I understand how that works for K through 12, but how does our early childhood duties fit into this discussion?
It's a great question. So I want to sort of separate off our work from the work that is going on related to the organization of the early learning system, and suggest that this committee's responsibility is not
sort of K through 20 today.
Is K through 20,
Okay.
not pre-K through 20, because so much, I mean, those discussions are considerably farther along on the early learning side, and there's actually a different vehicle legislatively for building out, taking the next steps on early learning to establish these hubs, as they've been called, and and there were significant steps taken by the last two legislative sessions to, for example, change the commission system, move the child care commission's responsibilities to the early learning council. That work is considerably
Okay.
more evolved
I
than
just want to
K-20.
so us not focusing on that today is actually okay.
That is, yes, better than okay.
Right. I will say, the way that this is teed up is that today we're going to present a broad architecture, and we're going to do a deep dive on certain elements. I think subsequently, in the next two meetings, we're going to do deep dives on the remaining elements. And I do think, Ron, the overall build-out and staffing of the OEIB, we're going to touch on that today, but there's still a lot of work left to do, and that certainly has to consider early learning, the whole enterprise. So I don't think we're going to, I think most of what we're being asked to address right now from an urgency standpoint is post-secondary, but I don't think we can develop a complete work chart, framework without addressing K-12 and early learning as well.
So one thing that might be useful over the next month, given the other entities, the Higher Ed Board, the State Board of Education, is just, they're clear on what we've been asked to do. I think this morning on the Higher Ed Board's governance and policy docket, they have a shared service discussion for higher ed, and it seems somewhat duplicative for us to be working on some pieces, or if we're setting the general architect to have other work happening at the same time that may or may not fit under the architect that ends up.
There's a benefit to having me on the, because being involved with higher ed, we're not going to have that duplication. And what they're doing in the Governance and Policy Committee is going to inform and, I don't want to say perfect, but certainly enhance our deep dive as a committee, because we need to know at a pretty granular level. I think the devil is in the details on this whole assignment that we're given. So I think to a certain degree more is more for December 11th. I think we need to be thinking about a fairly elaborate recommendation. And I think that all that work that's being done by the Board of Higher Ed, the Governance Policy Committee, is going to really help us. Now, how we dovetail this to, which I think maybe that's more your point, is I envision, and I've talked to Chancellor Pernsteiner and Chair Kelly of the Governance and Policy Committee, that it would be probably from a process standpoint to have them to start to weigh in on our straw proposal, and to have them actually react and respond to that. And that way we will get the input from the Board of Higher Education on our work. I think it's a pretty constructive process. And depending upon how far this goes, our reform goes, we might have to have some sort of a vote, if you will, from the full Board of Higher Education, but the hard work then will happen within that same Governance and Policy Committee.
Right.
I could have had them react to the straw proposal today, but I didn't want to have that until our committee had the opportunity to first work on this straw proposal.
I think it's not duplicative if it's viewed as informing our work, because I do think it's additive.
Yep.
It's just what I didn't want to have is that we arrive mid-December and there's sort of two sets of recommendations that may or may not be aligned.
What I would say is, as I look back on the legislative work group that was addressing institutional boards as a template, that legislative work group went forward and presented a recommendation or came out with a product that was informed by that governance and policy committee. And I think that's a fairly good template for us to follow. Okay. So with that, I think we're going to jump in and start getting to work here on the PowerPoint. So if we could perhaps pull that up. By way of background, what we are about to review is the product of a lot of work from a lot of folks. And let me start by saying that, I think the good news is that this has received a lot of input from a lot of folks. The bad news is that a very, very key person that helped lead those discussions is leaving us. So my very, very good friend and colleague, Brian Shipley, who has been absolutely paramount in getting us where we are, is going to be leaving in a couple of weeks. So I want to publicly recognize Brian, just extraordinary work that you've done in helping get us a very thoughtful document, a very thoughtful product, and we're going to squeeze everything we can out of you for the next 2 weeks and then wish you well. But in all seriousness, this is going to leave this committee an enormous hole that we're going to have to fill. So this really is bad news. It's great news for Brian and happy, but this committee owes a lot to Brian, even if we don't fully see all the work that he does. And so we're going to have to fill that hole going forward. So Brian, thank you very much. Beyond that, I would say that this is also a product that perhaps two buckets apply. This is a product that's been endorsed by some and we've received input from others. On the endorsement side, the governor and his staff have been very fully involved with this from the outset. So the governor has fully endorsed the direction we're going. And Ben has been deeply involved. Whiteboard session after whiteboard session. Likewise, Rudy, as our chief executive, has been involved in this and has also endorsed our product. The other group, but I would just characterize as more input-oriented, has contributed. We've had input and contributions from the chancellor, from CAM, from OBC, from students. University of Oregon, PSU, individual members of the Board of Higher Education. So there's been a tremendous amount of energy and contributions that have gone into this. And so even though this is the chair's proposal, straw proposal, by no means has this been me locked up in a room. So I want to say thank you to everyone that's contributed to what we have. So with all that background, now we can finally get to work. Unless there's any questions, I'll pause there.
So just a question on the process. As you're walking through the straw proposal, do you want us to have the discussion as you lay it out, or would you prefer to lay it out
Yep.
and then have the discussion?
This is intended to be a discussion along the way. Okay, and I will moderate and share the discussion, but I want to hear slide by slide. I started with the principles, not hoping to have a detailed rediscussion of all the principles, but more to signal that what we've done has been grounded in our principles. So I hope that we don't need to revisit principles. We can start on page 2, which is the straw proposal summary.
But you're persuaded, I guess, it's your proposal, that what's being proposed does accomplish those principles?
I will say that, hey Mary, what I would say, Ron, is they have guided us, and yes. Now, you will see a lot of TBDs in this document.
Right.
So that indicate that we still have more work to do to fulfill those principles. Like, for instance, one of those principles is around streamlining commissions and governance. We haven't really got to that yet in this PowerPoint. At the next meeting and the following meeting, we will.
Okay.
So those principles will continue to guide, but I won't say that we're done meeting those principles.
Okay.
In terms of the straw proposal summary, what this is, what we're going to talk about today is, I think, achieves the following. And I'll just roll down the left and then talk about it a little bit. Number one, if this is successfully implemented, I think it will achieve the objective of lowering student costs. Number two, promoting quality. Number three, it does really, should achieve the objective of the OEIB, which is to have a strategic approach to state investments. Number four, it continues to concentrate our limited state resources. Just to expand upon that, one of the big concerns as we consider local boards, are we going to suddenly disperse our limited state resources and have redundant programs and a lot of waste? I think what we're envisioning here would not allow that to happen, would continue the critical role of having statewide approaches that avoid duplication. Number five, key objective, and I think this can achieve that, is to create local boards that hopefully will promote philanthropy and other non-state resources. Number six, improves workflow, clarifies tight loose. Tight loose can be interpreted in a lot of different ways, as we've already heard on this committee. This hopefully will start to continue to clarify roles and expectations. Number seven, decentralization is, I think, a very key philosophical point here. It continues decentralization and empowerment, and actually enhances that and really promotes innovation at the local level. In addition, if I had to do this again, this is just, I would also add, and I think this is very key, is it clarifies specifically that the HEC is not in the delivery and operations business. This has been a very key point. Are we going to create more additional layers of governance and micromanagement, specifically around the community colleges? So you're going to see a diagram here that really distinguishes between what the state does, investment function, versus what the local campuses, institutions do. Very critically, you're going to see that the HEC is not on the right side of that chart. So we're not going to introduce a new governing board that's going to, potentially micromanage. So I think that's a miss that I should have made in this PowerPoint. And the second one, that's perhaps equally important, is that on the investment side, on the left side of the chart, even though there's a lot of TBD there, it really tees up that whatever board and commission structure, and for that matter even staff structure we have, can be fully aligned within the OEIB. Meaning that we're not going to have the HEC over here, early learning there. What this is envisioning is that as we build out the org structure on the investment board, it's going to be legislature, governor, OEIB, and then whatever subcommittee structure of the OEIB exists, perhaps commissions, it's all going to be with a very clear alignment around the mission. So that, I think, from a workflow standpoint, is absolutely essential. And so that's what's envisioned here as well. So I should have made those points clear in the document, and I want to make them clear here now.
So when you're talking about staff, are you talking about the deputy superintendent, all the
Talking
OED
about-
staff, all the OUS?
Well, we'll get to that. But what I'm talking about is building out the OEIB staff and supporting subcommittees of the OEIB. So still teed up for between now and December 11th is to really build out the OEIB staff and committees. You see that's teed up. But critically, what we are envisioning is you'll see an alignment here so that we're all pursuing one 40-40-20 strategy that is really developed by the OEIB.
But do you think when we're done with this by the 11th, it would be clear, for instance, if there was some new position in the state education hierarchy that somebody thought was a good idea, we would have made clear whether it was appropriate that that be an OEIB position or an OUS position or somebody else position?
I think so. I think so.
So we'd be able to go back to this and look at it and say, well, that function now belongs at OEIB, not at OUS.
That's
or
right.
Vice versa.
I think so. Yeah. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to really talk about what functions belong within the OEIB and on the investment side versus the local side. And we'll start to build a form around those functions. And then we'll subsequently finish out the form. And I think today, very critically, is we're going to put a pretty bright red line between where do the functions really reside? Are they within the OEIB or within the institutions?
So just one more on that. The governor and Rudy and others have talked a lot about, we don't want the K through 12 silo or a higher ed silo and so forth. Are we kind of talking silo a little today, or is there some?
Yes, we're going to talk about that. I mean, the logic here, and again, TBD in the subsequent two meetings, but I think what we want to, I think the starting point should be an org chart within the OEIB that is function driven as opposed to silo driven.
Right, because as we've talked about that, 10 through 14 kind of
Yep.
thing, I always understood our goal to be to blur the lines.
That's right.
there.
And I think the way you do that is having a functional org chart that's really building that P20 continuum as opposed to recreating age-driven silos. So I think that's the philosophy here. Now, we'll talk about in subsequent meetings, we might have learner clusters like 10 through 14, might be another, might be a group within those functions, if you follow me there, kind of a matrix type approach. But the dominant reporting lines would be more functionally driven.
Right, because you'll still have legally distinct entities. The Portland School District's a different legal entity than Portland State. And so, we're not, I think, proposing to blur those legal lines.
That's right.
But if we're talking about what we're doing with our money is investing in the education of students who may be flowing from one institution to the other,
Yep.
we do want to blend that funding.
Yep.
So,
That's
okay.
exactly right. Let me just dive a little bit on the right. Again, this is good. Just any questions that come up along the way. This is by no means exhaustive, but just to hit some of the highlights. In terms of lowering student costs, I think lowering student costs is a key objective of this whole P20 approach. If successful, we'll shorten time to degree and get our students through school much more quickly, efficiently, and increase the transferability and the utilization of prior credit, prior learning and so forth. And that's a big part of the essence of the P20. And I think building this out will hopefully achieve that. Shared services, we're going to talk about that a little bit. A key objective here is to avoid redundancy and to provide the opportunity for economies of scale and so forth. That should directly accrue to the students as well. Quality, a lot of the same themes, but I think what we're going to look at will hopefully create multiple venues for best practices, collaboration. We're not going to create an overly fragmented group of silos. And then again, it's streamlining governance and improved decision making. A lot of that work is still TBD, but I think the broad architecture really affords that. Number 3, on the strategic investment function, and we're going to talk about this, a very key element of this is that we are talking about having outcome-based post-secondary formula funding, including financial aid, residing inside of the OEIB. Big change. Number 4, concentrating STEM and limited state resources. this is largely a maintain statement, meaning that we're not going to suddenly create this big fragmented system where it's going to be a free-for-all and everybody's going to create. There are some real benefits. As chair of the Board of Higher Ed, I can tell you there's some real benefits in having a system around degree approval and mission approval and shared services, and we don't want to overly splinter and lose that.
Can we go back to some three? It says outcome-based post-secondary funding formula redesign. In the previous discussions, the inference was that it would be the whole system, and this is just post-secondary. Such a refinement. I think it's actually better to take one chunk at a time.
Yep.
But I just want to clarify, so we're not looking at changing the K-12, writing a recommendation on changing the K-12 formula based on outcomes in this exercise over the next month.
It's a good question. I think what we are mostly focusing on at this point is post-secondary. Number 5, hopefully fairly self-explanatory, given the long history of discussion around this topic. Number 6, tight loose. Let me just stop there for a moment. It's been very interesting to hear, to talk to Ben, to talk to Rudy, to talk to the governor, to talk to various folks about, really what is the paradigm that our investment board should really adopt. And we've talked about every sort of metaphor, steering and rowing and all this. I mean, there's just been a lot of metaphors. I will throw out a metaphor for our consideration. And this comes from my day job experience in the investment community. And so what I would observe is that there are very passive investors that provide money and write checks, and that's pretty much the extent of their involvement in investment activities. So very passive. And on the other side, the continuum, I would describe there are the horrific micromanagers that actually want to write checks and then think that they're actually in the business of running companies and so forth. Both of which I would suggest we want to reject as a role for the state, as a paradigm for the state. The middle ground it's not even middle ground, it's just better ground that I think I would offer is that of a strategic active investor. This is the state as an investor that's very active, very strategic, making very informed, transparent decisions around capital allocation with a degree of involvement in ensuring that those outcomes are achieved, which I think has been a pretty key point for you, Ron.
Yep, absolutely.
We're not just simply writing checks and saying, you go decide how to spend it.
Right.
And this is
wait 10 years to see if we're unhappy.
right. This is about building in, a pretty quick response mechanism, to measure accountability, see the accountability, and to be able to appropriately intervene without overstepping into the world of micromanagement and pretending that the state is something that it's not.
I think that's fine. I'm comfortable with that. To me, some of it is it's to me appropriate to upfront have some expectations as an investor. We're putting money into a venture and we want to see you improve X, Y, Z, whatever it is. So
that's the achievement complex.
That's right. It is achievement compact. But to me, that's where I've never liked the tight loose, because the achievement compact to me itself doesn't follow that. It's not an achievement compact that says we're sending you X dollars, sign here.
Right.
It's an achievement compact that says we expect you to accomplish these things.
Yeah.
And so that example, that to me, we're going to continue saying we expect you to accomplish certain things.
Yeah.
What those things are over time will evolve as we see what's working and what isn't, and so forth.
I'm going to pause there, I think, and I appreciate that immediate reaction, but Mary, Julia, just any reaction to what I said, or Ron said?
In terms of the type loose?
No, in terms of
Or the
really
active investor?
adopting a paradigm of being a strategic active investor.
So, and I don't know if this is the time to share this, because I think we'll probably get into it when we get to the next page, but when you have the division between the state and the education providers, and you describe the state's role as the active strategic investment, I think an active strategic investor makes sense for the type loose. I think it's too narrow in scope to describe the state's role. I view the state's role as providing the leadership, the vision, the mission, and it's more than just an investing role. And I think if it's described as just an investing role, it minimizes the leadership that should be delivered from, and that will be from the governor, the legislature, and on down the state list. So I think the active strategic investment and investor works in some aspects, but that it's not broad enough for the overall description of the state's role.
Well, let me just respond to that to say what you're describing is what the term is intended to capture, which is it's intended to capture that it's not simply a passive investor. And so the active strategic qualifiers are intended to connote vision and leadership as you're describing.
Well, I think, and this may be just the nomenclature, that investment makes it sound all about the money. And I think it will, and we've already had this discussion at many of our OEIB board meetings with people testifying about our role being primarily about just the money. And so I think the word investment leads people to the conclusion that the primary focus is about money when there is, I think, something that precedes the money. So that guides your investment decisions, but setting the overall agenda and providing the leadership, I think should be captured in addition to the investment piece.
I guess, again, I think we're saying the same thing. I mean, I think that strategic active investment qualifiers were intended to do that. If there's a better, we can work on nomenclature. I think what's important is that I think in terms of hearing your description, Julia, I don't think there's any separation. I mean, I think hopefully what we see in the functions align with what you're describing, even if in the title. So maybe we can see if the functions line up, and then we can also look at nomenclature at the top.
Yeah, I just think it would be it's the description that people are going to look to. So what's the role? And I agree with your description of how this is strategic and would guide the work in the education field, but to me, it seems like it will make it more of it's just about the money. So it's more how it gets messaged out about the work, and I think the legislature and the governors that feel they're more than about the money.
So as an example, Julia, just as I look up, the number one, if they're lower student costs, there are things that we could do to encourage sharing that with lower costs that don't really involve us putting any money in. It involves us saying, with the money you've got, you're being inefficient. And we'd like to see more sharing. I mean, that's an example I've used before, not in the higher ed, but it still bothers me that within 5 miles of where we're sitting right now, every single school district runs their own warehouse. I just think that's ridiculous. Well, at some point, do we decide they haven't got the hint that they should cooperate on those things? And so it's appropriate for us to come in and say, hey, how about if you started sharing some warehouses? Is that the kind of thing?
Yeah, well, and just setting out what the objective of the system is. It's whether the money's driving it or whether the money is the method by which you get your result. But you put it in the parking lot and we can discuss it more later, because I think we may get to
Let me say this. I think you're getting to a very critical question. that I think this will hopefully tee up, but it doesn't answer. And I think the same applies to higher education, which is how when you see those, call them centralized or shared opportunities, those collaborative opportunities, do you encourage them or do you require them? And how does the state make sure that we're not overly fragmented and missing those opportunities?
I think that debate about are we encouraging or requiring is a debate we can have later, but I wouldn't want the suggestion to be that we should do either.
Yeah.
And, some notion that, hey, it's none of your business that we're inefficient. I think the answer, we have to be clear, no, it is our business that you're inefficient.
Clearly. Now, I think with that statement, I think we're on the same page. I don't yet, in my own mind, have an answer on how we achieve that. Do we suggest or require? But what we're talking about is fostering collaboration. And on the right side, on the delivery side, gaining those economies of scale, gaining those collaboration opportunities. We talked about this a lot, actually, in higher education. I mean, there's tremendous opportunities by way of pedagogy that are evolving that really go beyond any single institution.
Let me take an outrageous example then, Mrs. Probert. Our pressure on institutions is degrees. We need 40% to have a bachelor's degree. So an institution decides the only way we can accomplish that, and the easiest way to accomplish it, is we're just going to offer lots more of whatever the cheapest degree is we have to deliver, and a lot less of the ones that are more expensive. Would speaking up and saying, hold it, time out, you can't just close down the science department and have everybody whatever cheapest. Would that be something you would see OEIB would call foul on, or does the legislature call foul on it, or who calls foul if complying with putting out degrees ended up actually undermining what we were trying to do? In an outrageous example, no one would do that, but just an example.
I think this envisions its OEIB.
Yeah, I mean, I think you say it's an outrageous example. I think it's exactly the kind of example, hypothetical, that we should have in mind. And because the OEIB is principally charged with helping to establish the outcomes for the system and invest or make recommendations for investment to help meet them, I think that would fall very directly within the OEIB's purview as we envision it, to say the outcomes the state needs are a certain roughly type of degree, not and more of this, less of that. I think that's an OEIB level discussion.
Mary?
Well, I think metaphors are only helpful to the extent that they bring clarity. And I don't know if this metaphor brings clarity. I do think it engenders a discussion, just like the steering and rolling engendered a discussion. Didn't quite fit, but it brought more clarity about what we saw as the state role and what we saw as the local or delivery role. And I think about this metaphor in the same way. How can we use it to get clarity on these questions? I don't want to get hung up on the words, but how can we use these ideas to get a clearer picture of what the state role is and what the local role is?
Okay. Well, I think we've already teased out one of the critical TBD discussions, which is what does the state do to ensure collaboration actually occurs on the delivery side? And I think that is kind of a key question everywhere in the B20. So, all right. Okay. Again, number 7 maintains local boards and further creates additional boards for U of O and TSU. So with that summary, want to shift over to a discussion of functions around the state versus the education providers. And I guess the first comment that I would make, and then I'll just invite comments, because everybody's had a chance to review this. But I think the real logic here is that this does take what is traditionally a vertical, top-down org chart, which if you think about Ben's org chart that he came in here and scared us all with last time, in addition to being very busy and confusing, it was also a classic top-down kind of pyramid, showing the state up on top in charge. And what this is doing is really creating much more of a horizontal, it's more of a partner role, where you've got the state is in partnership with these education providers, where the state's role is obviously, again, I'll use the term active strategic management. I haven't heard any comments from Julia or others that changes that, versus the education providers, which is operations and delivery. It's a pretty key, shift. And now but as you take one of the downsides of going from that traditional vertical is this issue that we've already teased out, which is the state still needs accountability. It still needs to make sure it's getting things done and not just simply passively investing. So, and then the glue between these two, and I think Ron, you said it, and this is the logic, is that in terms of identifying expectations, clarifying expectations, what is the transaction that should be memorialized with these achievement compacts, so that there's clarity around what the state is looking to invest in. With that, Ben, would you mind commenting on kind of the sources of the rest of what we're seeing here?
Yeah, sure. So we started, and I think it's really important to understand these categories came about as a result of trying to understand what are the core responsibilities of the state under a system that has the type of distinction that Matt's made, active strategic investment, operations delivery, whatever you want to call it. We began with the state side, and we attempted to really, in a very general way, establish the core responsibilities of the state. And they should express most of what the state does.
And when you say state, should we hear OEIB, or does state include something beyond OEIB?
That's a really good question, and actually thought of that in connection with the last discussion. I would not assume that the OEIB necessarily has responsibility or jurisdiction for every process the state undertakes with respect to education. I think that's not, I'm expressing probably as much of an opinion as anything else. But
so view that left-hand column as a combination of the governor, the legislature, OEIB, ED, whoever.
Clearly there are shared major ways in which this responsibility is shared,
right. Certainly
with the legislature. Very little of this gets done without legislative involvement and leadership. So I think we should sort of keep that question in mind. But my point, part of my point in starting with the state was to say we then took those categories over to the education provider side and said, well, what do those functions look like for an education provider, and how are they different? How does an education provider approach the work of great educators differently than the state? So whereas on the left side we're trying to identify a close to comprehensive list of state responsibilities, on the right hand side it's not a comprehensive list. Just understand, we expect and know that education providers, colleges, universities, school districts, early learning organizations are doing a whole lot more than these things. But this is really an attempt to compare and contrast the state's responsibilities in its comprehensive set of work with the local responsibilities in that same, but not comprehensive on their part, in those same categories. I mean, we looked at this last time. I'm happy to go into more detail about it.
Ben, is it stating that another way? Are you saying that the folks on the right side have other stakeholders and other investors and other funders beyond the state, and therefore, this is not comprehensive on the right side, but what it is saying is that in terms of their commitments to the state, this is comprehensive.
Yeah, that's one way of stating it. Just to make an obvious point, the right-hand side doesn't say anything about teaching and learning, which is the core of a education provider's work. So it's clearly not comprehensive on the right-hand side. But as we looked at the state responsibilities, which is attempts to be at a very general level, comprehensive or close to comprehensive, we said, what are the local education providers' connection to that work, and how is it different? And so the comparisons here were what we were trying to tease out in order to really get a better handle on the distinction between the state's roles and the provider's role.
So one thing that I think is missing would be on the state side, and this is going back to the leadership, it's more than an investment, setting the overall state direction and the goals. And then on the education providers, it's basically structuring their work to align with the overall state goals. But I mean, I think very much that's something that the legislature, the governor, OEIB, in the past, currently the State Board of Education and the Higher Ed Board, there's a very clear role, so setting out this framework at the state level, and there's a complementary local component of it.
I think that would be a useful addition here. In the previous chart, we presented the same information along with the kind of outcomes, the 40-40-20, and then the more detailed learner level outcomes that the OEIB has established along the left side. So that may be something we can pull into this chart.
The second bullet point under number 1. Is that? I thought that's how I interpreted it.
It expresses it. I think we can have a conversation about the extent to which those outcomes really guide the work, not merely in a funding sense, but the state's work in great educators, in policies and rules, in standards and assessments.
It's a very good point. So I think, in other words, maybe we would have 8, and the number 1 might actually be just establish and explain core outcomes. Because that I think you're saying that everything kind of waterfalls from that.
That's the intent.
Yeah, that's a good catch. Does that capture, Julia?
Mm-hmm.
That's good.
It's just a big frame up.
I agree. Okay. This is probably the right way to do this, is actually to hear other comments or feedback like that. So, Julia, do you have any other?
Some other comments on this page. So, on the intervention, and not to get into words with them, but the support and intervention to improve results, the 2 bullet points seem relatively soft, and to me don't seem like interventions. And I don't know if it's you taking the use achievement compacts to establish accountability and moving that up to the support and interventions. I guess I would be interested in Rudy's point of view on what the support and interventions look like, because trying new approaches and just participate in networks doesn't seem very supportive or when necessary, like it would be a descriptive intervention.
So, I kind of, I follow the first part. I agree with you, it is very soft. Participate and experiment are pretty passive. What was the remedy? I missed that.
Well, I think sharpening it up so that you're clear on are sort of the major tools in terms of supporting intervention. And then down to number 6, you have the use achievement compacts to establish accountability and to inform and motivate the public. But it seems like if the achievement compacts are one of your tools by which you're going to be making decisions on support and intervention, maybe it's
That could be the first
integrated
bullet
that in
point. Right.
that. But I'd like to hear from Rudy, because I don't think those the 2 bullet points would be tools that would be necessarily useful for Rudy, but you can tell me otherwise.
So yeah, I missed some of your point there. Could you say it one more time? I'm sorry.
Yeah, so under the state, the description of the state role, number 3, support and interventions to improve results. The 2 bullet points that are listed, 1, participate in networks and collaboratives, and the 2nd, experiment with new approaches, seem like very soft tools, and I would think that I would want something that's more descriptive that would either lead me to believe that it's a strategy or tactic that's going to help support either a school district or a university, or intervene when necessary.
I frankly would agree with that. I mean, from the standpoint of just where I think the tension is that, at least in terms of the sort of school districts who are loath to step too far away from the previous sort of ethos of both No Child Left Behind and, you know, sort of paint within the lines kind of notions. I think you've got a harder push, and you've got to. I think what's missing from that for me was just that we've got to drive people toward, sort of specific creative, toward unlocking those specific and creative new models that accelerate or advance the work. And if it's left to the sort of natural migration of people, what you'll essentially have is limited creative tension and lots of stillness around let's just not make too many waves or challenge the system in any way, since that's almost exclusively what we have learned for the last 10 years. I mean, I think that part of the benefit of this governance structure is that it actually takes a position on creating a more stimulating the demand for greater creativity, greater cross-sectional imagination and collaboration. And I think we need to be stronger about that, at least in our descriptions of this and or in our leanings organizationally.
So, Rudy, in the K through 12 discussion, and to be honest, sort of months ago, and I can't remember who said it, whether this is, Tim or Ben or you or somebody, but, we've talked in the past at the K through 12 level that if you had a district that was just miserably performing compared to others, that you could have intervention all the way up to basically a takeover by the state.
All the way up to what?
Taking it over. I mean, the state could basically take over a school district and, do dramatic things if you had a district that was, grossly underperforming expectations compared to others. On the post-secondary, I don't know what we think the most kind of radical thing that could happen is, but I think we ought to at least envision language here that anticipates that, the tight-loose notion, as I've always had this explained, understood, was, loose means we leave people alone who are doing a good job. But if they aren't doing a good job, the intervention becomes progressively more. And so here, beyond just collaborate, share ideas, that kind of thing, I think we ought to at least, since the category is titled Intervention to Improve Results, we'll hope it never comes to that, but I don't know what a more extreme intervention might look like.
Well, Ron, here's what tight loose does for me. It sort of creates a lot of comfortable ambiguity around who does what. What's our role when we find certain conditions? And let me give you 3 conditions that it sort of blends together. And in blending it, it creates a sort of sense of sameness for how we, or blurs it so much that there is no particular point of view about it. So the three conditions are, one, the one that you described a moment ago where, you've got and let me just speak specifically to K-12, or pre-K-12, that you've got a pattern of performance that is on the decline. And by a pattern, I mean that it is no less than 1 year, and we would never let it go any more than 2 years. But you've got a pattern where the indicators of that organization's health are showing that it is on the decline. So the question then is, in a tight-loose world, what does one do? Well, tight-loose doesn't describe that per se. It just sort of says that, that would be an example of something theoretically at least we tighten up on, but no one really knows what it is. And the law isn't particularly descriptive as to who has what powers to be able to do anything along those lines, at least not now. Second example would be in a district that is, really kind of right on the bubble, doing fairly well, has the capacity, demonstrates the will, really aligns resources with strategic outcomes and goals and so forth. And as a result, what's our role there? We should be facilitating their growth, their continuous improvement, et cetera. And that's a looser manifestation of this. And I think, I think that whomever it is would have the charge to basically, both talk with, influence, be a critical friend of people who are in that category. And then, of course, the people who are doing extraordinarily well, they're hitting targets on some basis, that they're really aiming at and getting. It's a pretty congealed and coherent organization. There should be some acknowledgement that the state basically says something like, a statewide, recognition and an acknowledgement that work is really good, and maybe there's something in there that we ought to really be looking at for best practice, and so on. So, in my mind, the tight-loose just blurs all of that, and it sort of says, we're just going to be tight-loose. And that worries me because we deny the reality that in this organizational surge that we have, there are going to be profiles in an apprehension as well as profiles in complete success and real innovation. And we're treating them in some monolithic way by this tight-loose mindset.
So let me suggest the following. We've got an hour left. We still have to get public testimony. This to me is one of those absolute ground zero issues, and I think we ought to take this offline. This will be a big part of the TBD after today, and I would just summarize as following. There's actually two issues two problems that need to get solved, and I think, Rudy, you're right. We have to be very specific about what we mean on this. This can't fall through the cracks. Number one is, again, on the collaboration, it's almost playing offense. In order to really, really achieve innovation, improve learning, improve, capture advancements in pedagogy and so forth, how does the state really achieve that? Do you leave it to the folks on the right side of the chart because it's in their own self-interest to innovate and so forth? Or do you play a more active role coordinating, requiring, and so forth? And this is kind of a key question. So again, more playing offense to achieve opportunities. And then the second one is what I would characterize more of a defensive question, which is in a bad scenario where your achievement compacts aren't being, we're not achieving, we're not getting results. What is the appropriate intervention method? And I would say on that last point specifically, there are pretty profound staffing implications.
Sure.
You want to get into the takeover business?
I didn't go there at all.
Oh, no, I'm not looking at you, Ron. I'm just saying, if the state wants to get into the takeover business, then you've you have to be able to deliver on it.
Right.
And so from our standpoint, I think that's that's a specter we don't want to, we really don't want to embrace.
It's where your example of investor, a difference between this and that is you're investing in a venture, business venture, and you think it's just going sideways. You stop investing and cut your losses and go away, maybe.
Or you get on the
Or
board.
no, or you intervene actively. I'm saying, but you have those options.
Right.
Here, we don't have that option to walk away. I mean, we can't just say we're going to stop funding and walk away. That's not an option.
Right.
So, before I comment on this page, I just need to back up to the first couple of pages. I thought we were going to go through the whole thing and then comment, but so let me just back up for a minute. In terms of the design principles, in number 4, the understand the function of independent local boards, I think that needs to be a stronger statement. I mean, I think what the governor has consistently said is we're not going to interfere, if he's used that word, with the local governance that exists. At least that's what his message to community colleges. So it's not just understanding, it's having a commitment in their design principles to the idea of local governance. When I look at this draft proposal summary, there are a few things on there that concern me, and again, I'm talking from the community college perspective here. One is that the OEIB maintains mission and program approval. That would be a direct change in how community colleges do their work, because the mission of community colleges is done by local boards based on local needs. And similarly, the word operations in number 6. Our boards are not operational boards, they're policy boards. And they certainly have a policy framework and a set of executive directions to their chief executive officer in how the operations are played out within a framework. But again, this would be a direct change for community colleges in how we see our work if we're thinking of ourselves as operational boards.
These aren't boards. This
Well,
is
but you're saying...
providers.
Well,
So what this is basically saying is the state is investment in the providers, meaning the institutions.
well, but institutions are run by boards of community colleges, and they're policy boards. They're not operational
Well,
boards.
this is intended to say the community college is in charge, provides operations and delivery. How it divides between its board and its staff, this is silent too. Should not be viewed as synonymous with boards. This is basically saying that Lane Community College is in the business of providing education, operations, delivery, and that your board can provide the policy and your staff can provide the execution, however you want to do that. This isn't prescriptive there.
Well, if it's not prescriptive, then I would say the education providers also have a policy role, because they currently have a policy role.
Policy around operations.
Yeah, policy about how the institution is run, a policy
That's what I
around
mean.
governance,
Well, right, okay. So,
policies for how we serve our local communities. Those reside with local boards.
okay.
So I've run into this point too with K-12, where to describe a K-12 board as strictly focused on operations or even the policy for operations is problematic in their terms, because they understand themselves to be operating in a policy environment, helping to establish policies for this local community that they are elected by, and elected on the basis of a kind of policy agenda that they may have run on. And so the distinction here, I think it may take some additional work to kind of get at the distinction that you were attempting to make, Matt. And I don't think there's real inconsistency here. It's
I
another
think
place
it's
where the
actually-
language may trip us up a little.
Yeah, actually, I think what this is, so Mary, this is intended not to be a change. And what this is intended to say
Right.
is mostly trying to say that the state is not in the business of operations
Exactly.
and delivery. That's left to the community colleges. So this wasn't intended to change any of that. It was intended basically to make it very clear, the red line is that the state is not involved with operations. So if there's a nomenclature that's more appropriate, I'm certainly open to that. So if you want to add policy or whatever, that's fine. It's just mostly trying to say that the state's not exempt.
Maybe it's on the chart where it has education providers, it has operations and delivery, maybe it's local policy and operations and delivery, so you're clear they're not setting the state policy, but there is a policy-making role that captures it. And then, so this is just for higher ed, but if you get down into the K-12 system, you're gonna have the same discussion with Mary there. So that maybe can accommodate that you're clear what policy role they have.
Yeah. The other, the previous comment around mission approval and all that was also not intended to suggest that there's going to be creep into the community colleges. Again, it was mostly intended to be maintaining, and this is mostly around the universities. We don't want to get into a situation where that is so diluted that you've got multiple high-cost programs. So this wasn't intended to suggest that the current governance structure for OUS is going to creep into the community colleges. It was mostly suggested to say, let's be reasonable on the universities and not break the valuable parts of the system that save the taxpayers and students money. So again, we can work on, maybe you and I actually offline, Mary, to work on that. I just want to be clear today that what you're stating as an objective is what's intended.
I mean, I think your clarification about this intended for OUS kind of brings me back to something that I've been thinking about relative to OUS, because it seems to me that the biggest change in governance that's going on right now does relate to the university system, in terms of thinking about institutional boards and what happens to the rest of the regional universities. And in thinking about what they need and want, for example, we heard that they believe it is a state role to set mission of the universities because of their statewide focus. That since we're looking at silos a little bit anyway, we're not looking at K-12 today, we're looking more mostly at post-secondary, maybe we need to be silo it just a little further to get to these clarifications about what the university system needs, and then what applies from that to community colleges, where we've had a local system of governance for a number of years. And then we can kind of put it back together and look more kind of whole system. But I think what we're going to find is that there are things that the universities need and want, and that the state wants for the universities, that are different from what community colleges need and want, and what the state wants for community colleges. But as long as we continue to have one look on the front end of the process at what they need, we're going to have conversations like this, that this doesn't apply to community colleges, or this does apply to community colleges. So I'm wondering if we could have, think about the universities, think about community colleges, and then put together the system.
Samantha, I'd at least encourage, because I know we're asking you a lot of questions, if you could maybe sort of finish getting through this part of the presentation, and then we can.
I do want to respond to what Mary just said.
I didn't mean to cut you off. No.
Yeah, no. I have been operating under the assumption, Mary, that as we really do dive into this question that you're raising, that we'll have a reasonable outcome. It'll become clear that they're very, very different, and that we will address that appropriately. So perhaps that has led to be somewhat nonchalant or cavalier in terms of putting this out on the front end, because I've just been operating at the assumption that we'll have a reasonable discussion through. In doing so, I don't want the implication to be that all of the comments that the community college community has been making has been ignored or not, hasn't registered. It's just the opposite. I think it's been very, very clear. And I've been operating on the assumption that in the TBD parts of this presentation, that we'll have a reasonable discussion. So this is not intended to be an end around all the very good commentary and testimony that's, that's been provided. So we were kind of on this chart here. I think Julia, I don't know that we allowed Julia to get through all of your comments on this one here.
Just for the sake of time,
Okay, you're good.
yeah.
Mary,
That's
did you
some
have
smaller items, but-
anything on this chart?
Well, I mean, the things that stand out for me that are important as a state role and what I feel as a local community college, certainly the deciding how much to invest, setting the outcomes, I think are state roles. And I think another important state role is managing the intersections. And that would be intersections between K-12 and community colleges, K-12 and OUS, and then community colleges and OUS.
Yeah.
And you could bring early learning in there as well if you're looking at the 0 to 20 system. The coordination of that is an important piece, and we have some groups that do that, but it's probably not as strong as it needs to be. And actually, it's at those intersections that there's the most opportunity for efficiency and better outcomes for students.
So I think this is that's intended under what's number 2, the third bullet point. Yeah, and as I read it.
Yeah, it is, but it's not fully captured by category 2 or the third bullet point. I mean, I think there's more to unpack here related to coordination. It certainly is broader than standards and assessments. A lot of the work that's gone on already that's been very successful in promoting outcomes is broader than standards. Or
It's
different than
analogous
standards
to
and
Julia's earlier comment around core outcomes is kind of a major, and so.
It's the click down from the
Right.
new number 1 of core outcomes, is
Right.
the alignment, integration, and coordination.
I agree, it's more than standards and
It is.
assessments, for sure. Okay. Good. Anything else? Ron?
Nope, I'm ready to go to the next page.
Great. So, with that discussion around functions, this is now teeing up, again, a discussion around form, some of which I would say is more developed than others. The key element on the left is an attempt at alignment between the legislature and the investment board and the chief education officer and its staff, and then the commissions. This is again attempting to start with the functions down below, and then I think a big part of our homework going forward is to really build out these commissions. I'll just won't say much more there. On the right side, I think we do have, we're much further along on the structure, on the education providers. And as stated many times previously, very notably, there's not a heck showing up on the right side. Community colleges continue with their local boards, as with the university system and OHSU, but there is a creation of local boards for PSU and U of O. And then what you see down below under the shared services enterprise with the TBD, this is a concept that I'd like to vet and explore, which would be to look at potentially an entity that would provide shared services, back office, that would, on an opt-in basis, that would enable these institutions to both save a buck and improve quality in terms of best practices. And so this is again a concept that would hopefully accrue value to the students and the institutions, but not be kind of a top-down, bureaucracy that everybody would have to. And it's very deliberately on the bottom, because essentially the institutions on the top would be the customers. And this would be a service provider for those institutions, and potentially even in a co-op type format where its governance would be comprised of the customers up top to ensure that it is providing the services that the customer, that its members want at a value that they demand. So again, not preordaining, but introducing this concept to see if this is something that would actually be an opportunity for the institutions on the right.
So no proposal at the moment for where the shared service enterprise would fit structurally?
No, I would say conceptually, an idea would be to have a separate entity whose governance is, again, comprised of the members in more of a co-op type format.
You know, the fear, just to say the horrible thing is, I don't want to end up with a higher ed ESD.
I think that hence the co-op,
Okay.
and hence the opt-in. Right, and I think that's a shared fear, and that was part of very consistent feedback that I heard and we heard. And actually, some of the better feedback I heard was with regards to the California system, where the various the various institutions may be able to acquire services from one another. Somebody's really good at it, or go to this separate group or do it themselves. And it would be their local board that would be involved with that decision as opposed to being imposed from on.
I like the opt-in model. Having been on the Portland School Board, we were one of the few that had an opt-in on ESD services, and I thought it worked well because it really drives the entity that's providing the service to view the entities as their customer and what are they providing versus a mandated, you have to purchase the service, so it's at a value from the customer.
Yeah.
I think it would also be worth looking at what, if you look at the sort of regional universities, sort of what do they need from a base level in terms of shared services if they don't have the economies of scale and some opt out, what's that base that's needed so that they know if people opt in and out that there's going to be a base level that they wouldn't get because they don't have the economies of scale.
Yep.
Let me talk about the left side a little. Is that okay to go back? The commissions box, a couple of things. First, it has an arrow pointing to the staff instead of an arrow pointing the other direction. And the line's a broken line. And so that's one question, sort of the relationship there a bit to the OEIB, Chief Education Officer staff business. And then second, maybe I'm missing something, but does that box have anything that's not in it? I mean, is there any notion that we have gotten rid of any border commission?
Well, the logic under the first, and this was very deliberate. The logic under the first is that the direct line of reporting and authority would be from the investment board to the chief education officer to the staff, and that on an as-needed basis, you would form commissions to basically advise and inform the staff.
But they're not under the chief education officer in this chart, so what's
The
that?
commissions?
Yeah.
Well, what it is the staff is. And so let's say that you had whatever, the staff member would have a direct reporting relationship to the chief education officer, and then a dotted line, if you will, to the outside commission. Now, this could be, and that's why the TBDs are all over this.
Right.
This could be more towards a committee structure of the OEIB, meaning that you build out the functions below. You really build out the functions. You create the staff under the chief education officer to achieve those functions, and then you And then you have subcommittees of the OEIB that would support and direct that staff, which is fairly
So I understand this is just a, it's a picture at the moment, I don't want to get too much, but to me, we really need to be clear what the relationship of those commissions is to both the OEIB and to RUBI.
I would agree, and I would say my starting position here, Ron, alignment is everything here. And what we don't want to create is a situation where we have multiple lawsuits, if you will.
Right.
Or multiple reporting lines. And that's why my starting assumption, again, this is all TBD, starting assumption would be that the direct lines of authority would be through the chief education officer. And that wherever possible, these commissions would be committees of the OEID.
Okay. That's not conveyed to me by this picture, so it's...
And maybe-
Fair enough. Now, I think when I've had this conversation with Ben, I've said just what I've said. I think Ben's pointed out very quickly that you're very quickly going to overextend the OEIB board members. There's just not enough of us with enough hours in the day,
We have other jobs.
right, of our volunteers to do that subcommittee approach that I'm talking about. And therefore, we might need to open the membership of those commissions and to be beyond just simply the OEIB membership. But what's important is that the direct line still runs up back through the OEIB, because it's the OEIB that owns the 40/40 or has
Well, I agree with that.
responsibility for.
The two concepts that to me aren't reflected here that are really important is first, I think the chief education officer needs to be the chief education officer for everything, not just for a subset of things. And so I want to make clear that, I mean, these boards can all be different people. I'm not eager for more assignments. I'm just saying, I think they all have to have a clear relationship with the chief education officer. And then the second question, which is just, we've always been afraid of, if we simply create more boards and don't get rid of any, I'm not sure we've accomplished the mission.
Let me surround both of those. The first one is exactly what's intended to be captured here by the solid line. So Rudy is accountable for the overall education enterprise. And these dotted lines are intended to suggest that they are not replacing Rudy. Rudy is the ultimate authority. And then on the other part, Ron, which is, how many commissions do we need? I think first we start with the functions down below, and then we build it out. And I think the goal would be to not proliferate a bunch of commissions, but that is all still, that is quite honestly the next meeting that we'll have. Hopefully we'll be reviewing that exactly.
I think what might be confusing is just the word staff and having their own separate box. So if it's Rudy's staff or the OEIB staff, it seems like that's the same box as Rudy.
Right.
And, I mean, if you're a appointed member of the State Board of Education, I don't think you would normally think that, like, you'd be going into a box with staff. So maybe that's the sort of cleanup, that it's just implied that you don't have a staff box.
We went round and round that, and I'll tell you why we wound it up like this, is that from the Board of Higher Education, what we have is we have an academic strategies committee who works very directly with the Vice Chancellor of Academic Strategies. So that is a staff person that reports to the Chancellor, and she is directly responsible for working with that committee. Likewise, we have other staff members within the OUS that work directly with committees. So that was.
Is this picture supposed to suggest those staff now report to Rudy? Or?
Yes.
So,
And it's the same way we do it at OUS. So.
I guess I'm with Julia, that all the staff, wherever they came from, if they now report to Rudy, they're just part of Rudy's box.
That's fine. That's fine. Well, that's what it's intended to convey. So if that's clear, then we can certainly do
And
that.
then, I'm sorry, just to clarify, but the staff then would be OUS staff, ODE staff, or this new
New.
OEIB?
New
So
OEIB.
where does ODE staff and
TBD.
OUS staff
TBD.
Well-
We're going to start with functions and build that out.
Yeah, I think, though, that this conversation and the conversation about shared services, for me, get to the question that Julia's asking. First of all, on the shared services, I mean, I think we've been charged with doing the governance and policy, and at least in my mind, the shared services piece is more of a second order. Once we have the governance and policy structure set up, then there are things that need to be done to make things more efficient, and shared services enterprise, which I'm really intrigued with, is one way to get there. But I think what that raises for me, when I think about what a shared services enterprise would do, is what does that mean for the Chancellor's office? What does it mean for CCWD? And again, I think it's a second order issue, but if you're gonna, I think if we're gonna talk about shared services, we've got to start talking about what's the role of the Chancellor's office in a new configuration, and what's the role of CCWD in a different configuration. So I see those as, I see that discussion as happening after we've created the state role and the local role and the structure for governance and policy, because this to me is more administrative in nature.
So on that, I don't disagree. The reason why it's addressed concurrently as opposed to linearly is because overall there's so many implications to the Chancellor's office just by doing the first step that I think it begs questions around the Chancellor's office that actually need to get addressed concurrently. And so even though it is a second order in terms of the logic, I think in terms of when it gets addressed, I think there's a lot of advantages to addressing it concurrently. That was why we did it. The alternative would be just to keep status quo with the Chancellor's office, break out University of Oregon, break out Portland State, and then say, okay, work out the shared services in the future. I think that approach does continue a lot of uncertainty around staffing and so forth that I would find very detrimental, and should we'd be much better off addressing that sooner as opposed to later. So that was the logic here, without at all disputing the fact that it is kind of a second order question.
I guess that's fine. I just think if we're talking about reorganization of state agencies, or OUS, the Chancellor's Office, CCWD, I think we should just say that's what we're doing. Sure, I mean, you get there by thinking about what a shared service enterprise does. It's kind of some of the back office stuff that those state agencies are doing. But I think we should just, if that's what we're really doing, is looking at the role of the Chancellor's Office, looking at the role of CCWD, looking at the role of ODE, I think we should just be crystal clear that that's what we're doing, and communicate that to folks.
Fair enough. I mean, I think that's fine too. I mean, this is still trying to a certain degree honor the, form follows function. So I mean, this is still trying to stay with more of the function theme. But if it's helpful for folks to say, okay, and then there's a form discussion coming very soon, and we're not hiding that. There's certainly no attempt to hide that. At this stage of our committee's work, I'm still trying to stay at functions, and that was really the
And I'm good with, I'm fine with that.
The logic
Yeah.
there.
Something that may be helpful for the committee to see at the next meeting, going back to this question of the relationship between the OEIB, the Chief Education Officer, and his staff, and these commissions, is the current system, and it's a very new one, but it exists in law and in practice, for the OEIB's relationship with the Early Learning Council as a sub-council in some senses. The Early Learning Council operates under the direction and control of the OEIB and is an advisory to the OEIB for outcomes and investments related to early learning, but has its own kind of full stop authorities with respect to childcare, administration of childcare rules and regulations, and some other pieces of work, and has a relationship with the not a supervisory one, but a statutorily articulated relationship with a member of this education cabinet of Rudy's, our early learning director, who reports to Rudy and to the governor. It is a way, I think, of at least putting a model on the table, Matt, that I think gets at the kind of relationship you may be envisioning, and that we could at least discuss as we move on to K-12 and post-secondary.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Let me suggest we turn the page, because it's the same page with just a couple of things called out. Maybe before we do so, there is one last point I said before, but I'll say it again, which is that, very, very importantly, part of the logic here, and Julia, if it's clear on this chart to make the chief education officer and staff all as one, that was what was intended to be communicated, so that we're going to have a CDO in charge of an enterprise. So that is the idea. This is supposed to emphasize alignment.
Yep.
So whatever we can do to graphically make that key point. The other, that we haven't really talked about since, the very beginning of the meeting, is that this is really envisioning a very function-driven organization. So this is not going to be, the starting point was not here to recreate the silos under Rudy. This is intended to really start with much more of a functional orientation under Rudy, and then build, the staffing and the commissions around that. So this is really, the logic there is very P20 oriented, which I take to be one of the main objectives of the whole OEIB.
Right. So, Matt, I don't know if maybe it's an assignment for this committee after we finish this assignment, but something you said earlier. I think we do have to think about what's the role of the OEIB that lets it be a manageable role for its members. Because we're not going to attract people to be on this if we turn this into a gigantic job. I mean, it's got to be something where we're attracting people who are giving Rudy the assistance he needs and providing the whatever the governor's asking us to do. But ultimately, Rudy and his staff are running this system. And so while I think it's important that OEIB have the broad purposes we've talked about, it can't turn into a broad time-consuming role that makes it unmanageable.
That's very good.
So there may just be sort of a practical discussion we should have. It doesn't have to be on the December 11 timeline, but I don't want this to grow ridiculously.
Very good.
Before we turn the page, we just have two things. Under the functions, one thing that I'm not sure is quite captured, but certainly important to school districts and universities is capital investments, and how, where those functions will sit. And then, I guess if you're from the K-12 system, it seems like it might be worth playing it out so that people see how the K-12 system sits. If it's a maintenance of the status quo with local boards driving things, maybe it's setting them up in the same structure, and if you have the local policy and operations and delivery as the header, it will sort of address both the community college and the local board, school boards issues.
That's very, very good. Last slide. And we're actually doing okay on time. This is the same one, but just with a little emphasis provided around. We've all talked about it many, many times. This joint collaborative activities. I mean, this is again, I think, a key homework assignment for us is how do we achieve that? How does the state encourage or require or mandate these joint collaborative activities? And then I just, again, wanted to call out outcome-based post-secondary funding formula redesign, including financial aid. There is a memo, I think everybody hopefully had a chance to see that speaks a little bit more to that. I again want to thank the Chancellor and Cam for their thoughts on this. And this is a key homework assignment is to continue plowing forward with that.
What would you, if it's a homework assignment, what are we supposed to turn in?
Not for this, yeah, I think this is going to be, again, with the Chancellor and with Cam to continue building that out.
So do you want feedback on it for next meeting, or how?
Yeah,
What do you want
yeah,
to actually?
I think what'll happen is their work will be presented at the next meeting, and this committee will have opportunity for feedback. And just to reiterate, and we've said this all along, but again, the HEC is not anywhere on the right, commissions and so forth, everything's aligned on the left. So with that, that's kind of the final.
Is there, when you say it's not on the right, the Board of Education's also not on the right anywhere relative to community colleges?
Yep.
I know that, so that's also a changed rule that,
It's not a governance role, right?
okay.
And just to make sure that, just test the assumption, so everything on the right, and theoretically, if you're going down to the K-12 school districts, each of those boxes will have a achievement compact with OEIB.
That's right.
So PSU,
Yep.
U of O, OHSU, theirs will be directly with OEIB.
So I think we've got a little bit of a challenge here with the achievement compacts and with outcome-based funding. Because we talked about the achievement compacts as not being connected to money, as being non-punitive, and resulting in support and assistance intervention, more oversight potentially, if people weren't meeting their goals. And now we're talking about outcome-based funding, which is connected to pretty much the same metrics that are in the achievement compacts. So I think we've got, OEIB I think has a little bit of a challenge there, because we said one thing and now we're morphing into something else, and I think there's going to be a trust problem around that. The other thing, and I can only speak for community colleges, and to a certain extent myself, I have not heard a credible definition that differentiates between outcome-based funding and performance-based funding. And given that, when I look at the research on performance-based funding in community colleges, there is no evidence to suggest that it does anything to support improved student learning outcomes. So I just want us to be thoughtful about how we have this conversation, so that we are actually looking at what other states have learned, looking at the right set of metrics, looking at the achievement compacts, and I mean we're talking here about them being connected to accountability, which is the way I've always seen them, but there is another conversation going on now about them being more regional and not so connected to accountability. So I think we just need to sort through all the conversations that are going on.
Where's the conversation about them not being linked to accountability?
Well, there's a conversation going on about accountability being more on the report card side on K-12 and on institutional scorecards in higher ed. I was in a conversation at the University of Oregon with superintendents and the university just the other day, where it had been reported by one of the superintendents that he was in a meeting with other superintendents where there was a discussion about them being less related to accountability and more looking at regions having common achievement compacts. So these discussions are going on.
I'm sure they're going on, but I'm not aware of them going on that the OEIB's signed up on those changes.
No, I'm not either.
There are all kinds of people having conversations on the
Right.
like, but to me, the investment we're talking about here is achievement compacts are supposed to have every one of these institutions driving towards 40-40-20.
Mm-hmm.
And our investment should be designed to get us there. And if we see folks who are not getting us there, we need to do something about about it. And and so to me, disassociating the funding or our role from success towards that goal would be completely unacceptable. I don't know how other people are talking about it, but that's the whole reason we exist, as far as I can tell, is to make sure that the state is using its resources to accomplish that goal.
Yeah, I'm trying to differentiate, Mary, between your comments about the research, not supporting outcome-based funding and so forth, with the general policies and direction of the OEIB. As Cam has reported here, Department of Community Colleges Workforce Development, working with the President's Community Colleges, developed fall new formula that would repurpose much of the community college support fund to pay colleges for specific achievements and outcomes. So this work is underway, and so you're suggesting it shouldn't be underway?
No, I'm not suggesting that. I mean, I think a conversation about how community colleges look at their funding formula to balance access and success is a very appropriate conversation. I can tell you that conversation isn't going to be done by next month, because most of the presidents haven't been involved, the boards haven't been involved.
This isn't intended to suggest that.
Well, but for the 2013 budget, I just don't see how that's possible.
Yeah, I think we can take this discussion offline versus, 2013 versus creating a structure for a long-term shift in the funding formulas over to the OEIB. I think that's what this is intended to be. But I mean, if these are kind of philosophical discussions around what the OEIB should be doing, then certainly we should be taking them up within the OEIB. I'm taking it as part of our mandate here is to, as Ron said, to link our achievement compacts with our investment strategy. So with that, I do want to leave some time for public testimony.
We've spent the whole time asking questions, but I'd at least like to say before you move to public comment that I really appreciate all the hard work that went into this.
Yes.
And I really think this advances the ball enormously, so.
Thank you.
Well,
Ben was
no,
nice to
that's-
hear it too, but
yeah,
thank
well,
you. Thank you all.
That's very nice of you to say. Before we go to public testimony, I guess what I will say is thank you as well. Obviously, everybody read the materials and had a lot of very good input. And I will observe that I think the feedback from the committee thus far has been very additive, but also supportive of the general direction here. I don't see anything majorly broken in terms of. I think hopefully, Mary, you raised many points of clarification. That again, I think what I hear is a consistency between where this is going, or what I had in mind, and your concerns, with a lot of the details to be determined. I don't think that the major point around changes in the community college governance and so forth, I think that was received and was intended to be incorporated in what was presented here. So hopefully that was reflected.
What I heard generally, and I specifically heard Rudy talking about, is to the extent we can have real clarity instead of ambiguity,
Right.
it's going to be better for everyone.
I agree with that. And I think the big issue here, I mean, there's obviously, we talked a lot about, community colleges and the governance there. I think the single biggest issue, and we've been wrestling with this at OEIB from the very outset, is really defining what the active strategic part is, so that what do you do on intervention, and then what do you do proactively to achieve collaboration and innovation. I think those are the details that we have to get to. Rudy, did you want to comment before we go to public testimony?
I just wanted to kind of at least just put a finer point on something Mary said, because I want to hear the general thinking about this from its inception, relative to compacts. So there has been a discussion, let me just own this, there has been a discussion relative to the question of what is the right mechanism for building a sense of cross-institutional sort of mutuality and shared enterprise, if you will, in the building of both structures, strategies, policies, models that accelerate the growth of students, and to do so within the context of various regions throughout the state. That what is happening in Eastern Oregon, for example, with respect to the Eastern Promise, it's well worth being replicated, but it is not the source of a requirement, if you will, in every region, but rather the notion is that it would, by virtue of being successful, would have the ability to be a new idea, a new construct that actually moved across the state by virtue of its success. And I guess the question I have is, to what extent, as this was initially conceived, because I've heard two points of view about this, as the notion of compacts was initially conceived, what was the intent, however explicit, to sort of encourage and build a sense of P20 cross-pollination, building of new knowledge, sharing of new models, etc. Was that part of this, or was it solely as an accountability vehicle for ensuring achievement along the P20 continuum?
Well, Rudy, this is Ron. I chaired the committee that did all the initial work on this, and the earlier drafts of those documents were much longer, precisely because of your sort of number two goal. We wanted those documents and the relationship to communicate that we're supposed to be working on a partnership that strives towards all of these efficiencies and blending the systems and so forth. Ultimately they got kind of narrowed down to a shorter thing that looks more like an accountability document, just for clarity and convenience and so forth. But I think absolutely the message of the compacts is supposed to be everybody who signs one is signing on to being a partner in a larger venture. And the larger venture is the one of joining hands with the other education providers in the state to work towards the 40-40-20 goal and all we've talked about.
Right, and what my takeaway, Ron, is that as I've gone out and both looked at this on the ground, I'm looking at a sort of two levels of conversation that are instructive as to how we go about doing this. One is, just the natural and somewhat gnawing reality that a lot of this happened fast enough that people really needed to kind of aim at. They're really sort of asking the question of, do we have the right metrics to get us there? There's some refinement going on in that area relative to every level of this. Second issue, which is actually more the reason for me asking this question, the second issue is these compacts assume essentially a kind of a pyramid-like structure. They assume that there is the power in OEIB to both ask for and to some degree help to set what those targets will be. And there is this, at least at this juncture, there is this question, if not slightly more of a bone of contention, as to whether or not there is a way of allowing this to be structured such that the mutual relationships and the power sharing, if you will, is as much lateral as it is vertical. That there's real sort of sense in how, in helping to incentivize how early learning centers and community or hubs would really have a relationship with the school districts, and districts would have that same relationship. What Barry was saying earlier about the management of those intersections, that's where the devil is in the detail right now, as I'm seeing it on the ground. We're able to get people, however willy-nilly it may ultimately feel right now, we're able to get people by force, really, to simply send in their compacts. What we're not getting, at least what I don't see on a regular basis, is that people are able to see the compacts as generating cross-institutional P20, if you will, kind of contacts and sort of capturing of imagination that allows for people to sort of build this level of accountability to one another toward the state's 40-40-20 goals. And where it is happening not because of compacts, it's happening because they were doing it anyway. And it's happening out of the relationships between and among individuals who own or who run those institutions right now. But it's, at my judgment, it's fairly episodic. It's not consistent across the state.
Well, Rudy,
The question of regionalization of this was a question that grew out of some of the discussion that we had in the forums when we went around the state to say, how would we build this sense of mutuality and yet at the same time have it be, if you will, still an accountability structure, but it's an accountability structure to a set of goals that are driven somewhat in the same way as we are talking about compacts now, i.e. their specific metrics at every level, but they actually a conversation.
Rudy, I think, I'm sorry, were you done? You cut out. I just say that I think the issues you're identifying are exactly issues that...
But anyway, I just wanted to make sure that you understood that that is a conversation that is being had at this point in time, and it's not to walk away from accountability, it's to see, is there another way of being able to get both mutuality and accountability into the same bucket.
And I think there's a huge desire to both have the compacts themselves go further down that line, and especially to have people entering into them have a broader understanding of how it all fit. And when that first round of compact went forward, it's really the same as this committee's dealing with today, which is that we had a task that you could spend a year on, and we had a month to do it. And so, to me, I don't think we should at all stop and think that first draft of compacts that we entered is sort of it, and now we just renew them every year. I think we need to have a very good discussion about what the compact ought to look like, but more importantly, how do we make sure people understand the commitments they're making and are bought into it and so forth. So again, to me, just like I was saying to Matt earlier about the role of this committee, whenever we get done with this December 11th tile of work, I hope whoever the right group is starts thinking about what do we want Generation 2 of compacts to look like.
I couldn't agree more. And I would say, Rudy, what you're starting to do is tee up that second generation discussion.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that's right. And I think for our committee, even before that second generation, we have to also ensure that that second generation discussion occurs through the governance structure that we come up with. Because Rudy is intrigued by this regional approach, and I want to make sure that we somehow what we want to move is from episodic to more process and structural. And I think Rudy and I have talked about the regional approach. I want to look at that approach and alternatives, but somehow I think out of this committee we want, again, to move beyond episodic and singular achievement compacts with individual institutions towards something that starts to synthesize this P20 and makes it so that somebody's waking up every morning and thinking about it.
And I'd encourage Rudy and Ben to kind of, I don't know if it's this committee or some other committee we have, but somebody ought to be given the assignment of getting to work on Generation 2.
We're losing Julia. We're losing Juliet, and that's fine. I'm actually, we're now just a little bit over our assigned time. But before we do break, we do have one person that has signed up for testimony. So I want to invite Andrea Anderson up, please.
And Matt, I also have to depart, and I'll ensure my staff gets me notes on the public testimony.
Okay,
I apologize
thank you very
to
much.
Andrea there.
Okay.
And you weren't in the room earlier, but we were talking about that. I really think this is an excellent start, and I appreciate all the great work.
Great. A lot of credit to Matt.
All right, thanks, Andrea.
All right, thank you. For the record, Andrea Henderson, Executive Director, Oregon Community College Association. I'd like to start by thanking you for your work and the conversation you're holding today. I think what's really important is starting with that understanding of what is the state role and what's the local role and what's the intersection between the two, I think is the right first question as we look at all of this work. So what I'd really like to do is focus my comments on that piece of it today, so that we can really get clarity around that before we have the conversation in terms of the what boxes go where, which I think is the next level of conversation. As we look at the conversation today and look at your diagrams with the right side and the left side, I think one of the points I really want to emphasize is as we look at community colleges and the role of community colleges with the local boards, with the presidents, with the work that the community colleges are doing, there is a significant amount of policy that is done at the community college level. And to somehow separate this out where the state plays the leadership role and the institutions are the operations and delivery system, I think loses what is one of the real strengths of the community college system. We are doing state policy at the college level collectively. And we may not be a system. We may have 17 independent colleges, but each college is looking not just at how do I implement and deliver services to our community, but where are we going as a state? What's the role of community colleges and where we're going? How do we change what we're doing to make sure that we're being effective for Oregon as a whole? And so that part of that state conversation is happening at the local level as well. And it's really a partnership between the state and the local level that's working really well, that's moving us forward as community colleges. And as we talk about change, my worry is that some of that gets lost in the sense that those conversations belong just at the state level. And it really loses that richness of having the conversations with people that are both at the state level and on the ground. And it's that communication between the two that leads to a product that at the end both is the right direction, it has the buy-in, it has the support from the state, it has the resources from the state, it has the leverage from the state, but also has the buy-in from the local level in a way where they feel ownership of the direction that they're going. It's working very well, and so we want to make sure that any conversations about change doesn't change what is working well. A couple of very specific examples. When the conversation first started about 40-40-20, which started with the Oregon Business Council, the community colleges immediately entered into that conversation and collectively talked both at the local board level, at the state board level, at the OCCA board level, to ask the question of what does this direction for the state mean? What does it mean for community colleges? What's our role in it as community colleges? How might we look at ourselves differently because of this conversation around 40-40-20, which was very much a state leadership role that the colleges embraced and really looked at how they are operating and move things forward. And since then, over the years, we have really focused on the idea of student success and completion, have attracted 38 million plus in grants to come in because of the work that's been done through collective efforts on the local level. So I think our interest is really understanding that partnership and really making sure that that it doesn't become delineated into a state role and a local role that ignores that and becomes an either or, but it's really that short shared sense. And with that, we look forward to further conversations with you and talking about how we can make this work for everybody. Be happy to answer any questions.
I do have one question. So, Andrea, I'm not sure if you were here during the part of the discussion where we talked about actually changing and adding the word policy to the education providers. Mm-hmm. There was a qualifier that it was local policy, but I heard you say it was more state policy, even done at the local level. I feel strongly about I think the concept's well understood. And if I understand your point, it's that you don't want this to be a one-way street where the state is issuing edicts to the community colleges about what state policy shall be, and then you just go deliver. And I think that's right. I think with all the institutions on the right, there's got to be a kind of a two-way, discussion around these achievement compacts that achieves what you're talking about, which is some shared ownership around the success of the state. So that's what's intended here. So I guess wanted just
okay.
Reassure you. But I did want to ask a specific question around what do you think a broken scenario might look like? What should we look to prevent? And with regards to the relationship between the OEIB and the community colleges, is it that one-way edict or some expectation, or is there something else I'm missing? And second one, what is a functional relationship looking like? Is it the two-way discussion that I described, or again, is there something else I'm missing?
So let me take the first one in terms of what a broken system might look like. And I think it really does capture that idea that the state says, do this, implement this,
Yeah.
in a way that maybe isn't doable at the local level, is going a slightly different direction maybe than what's needed, that there isn't that two-way conversation about where we need to go. I think that's what we really want to avoid. I think in a system that's working, part of what makes it work is it has that sense of, you have the state that's looking at it from the state perspective, but you also have the local boards, the local presidents, the local community college groups looking at it from an implementation perspective and looking up. And it's the combination of the two that I think gets to a product that actually works. So I think as things, any kind of change that is implemented, as change is made, it's not just telling colleges, here, go implement this, but that first step of what is it that we're implementing has that feedback from the local level. So let me take the example specifically of the conversation today about the funding formulas. And we are having a conversation about that. It's a very rich conversation, and it's starting with the question of saying, not we need to implement a new funding formula, but asking the question of, does the system we have best support student success and completion? And is there any changes that we can make in it that would better benefit that? It's a very good conversation. What's working about the conversation is it's coming from the local level. Presidents will all have a chance to weigh in on it. Boards will have a conversation, so that when we get to a point, whatever that result might be, it's going to be a collective work from the community colleges. At the same time, there is a state role in that, and Cam and her office is really working to push the conversation forward, collect the best information around the conversation, and really help facilitate that conversation so it comes from both sides. So we'll get to a good spot. I think that's what we want to maintain, is that sense that those that are on the field, on the ground, have a role in developing state policy. So it's policy that works, that's going the right direction, and it's a shared vision.
So on the former point, about one-way edicts and so forth, we don't have a long track record at all, but it does seem like the Achievement Compact should provide the vehicle for that two-way discussion. I mean, this is a compact, which is a two-way transaction. So, and again, who knows? 5 years from now, we might see that things aren't functioning well. But it does seem like I'm optimistic. It does seem like that's the essence of the Achievement Compact, is to really bring both parties to the table and say what are the shared expectations and outcomes. And so, is there a possibility for the state to be overly heavy-handed? Sure, but it does seem like there is a constructive forum to develop that. And I would think if the state's functioning well, it's going to listen to bottom-up arguments, very, very well. If it's functioning poorly, it's not. So,
I just want to, just to sort of Mary's earlier point about making sure we respect that each community college has a board that has a role, and we need to respect that role. You're adding to that another point, I think, which is that the community colleges collectively have a role. You view that under this new arrangement still as a sort of an informal, just, we need to make sure that OEIB and Rudy and everybody remember to talk to the collective community college leadership, or are you thinking that's more formalized in some way? We enter into achievement compacts with Lane Community College, and we can make sure it properly respects the role of Lane Community College's board. We're not entering into any achievement with the colleges collectively, and so the mechanism doesn't have a box on it anywhere for how we talk to the community. So are you just comfortable that the point is, make sure Rudy and everybody remembers to talk to y'all collectively, or do we need to do something more structural?
great question.
I think that's a really good question, and I don't know that I have an answer for you today, because that is, I think, a structural change, and frankly, I'd want to go back and talk to the colleges and say, well, What do you feel comfortable with? How do you want it more formalized? Do you like the method we have? And so without having that conversation, I couldn't quite answer that question.
Okay, because I certainly agree with what Matt said, which is this is a human thing ultimately, which is
Right.
we got to hope that Rudy and everybody involved is picking the brain of everybody who's involved here. But whether we actually put a box on a chart somewhere or require them to an agreement is a different question.
I think part of it is how, what the approach is to bringing some sort of solution to the table. And right now, there's multiple examples that aren't formalized but works, whether it was through the joint boards process. And the joint boards may have gone to, for example, the Council of Instructional Administrators and said, here is a piece we need to develop. Go work on it and bring us back your best thinking. And generally, that best thinking was then incorporated into state policy. There's numerous examples throughout the system where that's working. And it's the appropriate people that are on the ground designing what the state policy should be in a way that works. And so it's not necessarily formalized, but it's done in a way that really values that ground-up approach to problem solving and strategic direction. And I want to make sure we don't lose any of that.
Well, and it's so embedded in the way we do our work. I mean, it's just the way we do our work. And so I think, even although you don't have a specific answer to the question, I think it's fair to say that one of the tests of anything that we do will be held up to this idea of the collective work that we do and have been very successful doing. And is it going to mess that up, or is it going to enhance it?
Right, and I think I've never understood anything we're doing here as being, having a goal of messing that up.
Yeah.
So I just want to make sure that, we structurally talk about how to take advantage of it.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Any final comments from committee members? Okay. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you 26th, I believe.